She didn't drink herself to death. She didn't overdose in a hotel room. She was destroyed, methodically, publicly, and legally. Frances Farmer had a voice that could fill theaters and a face that made headlines. But what she also had, unforgivably, was an opinion. About the studios. About religion. About society. And she wasn't afraid to shout it. In the era when actresses were meant to smile, obey, and disappear, she roared. The punishment? Years locked in psychiatric hospitals. Rumors of electroshock, lobotomy, and brutality haunted her legacy for decades. Some say she went mad. Others say she was made to go mad. This is the untold story of Frances Farmer. When Frances Farmer first stepped onto a stage, the audience didn't just watch her, they held their breath. She had that kind of presence, electric, cerebral, hypnotic. With sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, and an intelligence that simmered beneath every line she spoke, Frances was never just a pretty face. She was something else. Something Hollywood didn't know how to handle. Born in Seattle, Washington, Frances made headlines long before her film career began. As a high school student, she won a national essay contest with a piece titled "God Dies." An inflammatory cry of independence that already hinted at the firestorm to come. It wasn't just writing, she was a thinker. A challenger. And it terrified the establishment. After studying at the University of Washington and earning a degree in drama, she traveled to the Soviet Union to study theater, another scandal in 1930s America. But Hollywood came calling. And Frances, reluctantly, answered. Signed to Paramount Pictures, Frances debuted on screen in 1936 with Too Many Parents. But it was Come and Get It, 1936, that made her a household name. She glowed on film, not with the polished radiance of a studio product, but with something raw, fierce, and unsettling. Her beauty wasn't just physical, it was defiant. Audiences were captivated. Studios were unsure. She was labeled the next big thing. Compared to Katharine Hepburn and Bette Davis, praised for her serious acting chops and unwillingness to play dumb. Magazines called her the thinking man's star. Her photographs were everywhere, standing tall in shadowy lighting, eyes unwavering, as if challenging you through the lens. Even her smile looked like a dare. But behind the image, tension brewed. Frances loathed the publicity machines. She mocked studio press interviews. She refused to play the dumb blonde. And she rejected the idea that she should be grateful for fame. In a time when actresses were carefully molded, Frances broke the mold, and refused to be glued back together. She didn't care for cocktail parties or power plays. She wanted Shakespeare, not sequins. She wanted truth, not gossip columns. Her contemporaries described her as dazzling yet remote, like a beautiful sculpture that could suddenly come alive and question your every assumption. She was intellect in a sea of glamour. And that made her both revered and feared. To the public, Frances was the woman who could have had it all. To the studios, she was the woman who refused to play the game. And in Hollywood, that refusal doesn't go unpunished. Long before the headlines. Long before the studio contracts. Long before the madness, there was a little girl standing by a window in Seattle, waiting for someone who rarely came home. Frances Farmer was born into a house filled with unspoken rage. Her mother, Lillian Van Ornum, was a woman obsessed with appearances. A mother who lived vicariously through Frances. Who dreamed of social elevation, and who demanded perfection at any cost. Her father, Ernest Farmer, a lawyer, was emotionally distant, often absent. Their marriage, like many of the era, was cold. Mechanical, unyielding. From an early age, Frances learned to perform not for applause, but for approval. Her brilliance was both armor and rebellion. While other girls memorized etiquette, Frances devoured Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. While others prayed in church, she wrote, "God dies." She wasn't seeking fame. She was seeking escape. Behind her fearless essays and bold public statements was a child trained to repress pain. Lillian, her mother, often dismissed Frances's tears with cold lectures. Love was conditional. Emotions were inconvenient. Stand straight. Smile. Be smart, but not too smart. Be beautiful, but not threatening. By the time she entered university, Frances had already built walls of steel around her vulnerability. She could quote philosophy to silence a room, but she could not say, "I'm scared." She could recite Hamlet, but couldn't speak of the loneliness that gnawed at her in every dressing room. What no one saw, what even her closest friends struggled to name, was the slow-burning trauma of living in a body controlled by others. Her mother orchestrated every step of her early career. When Frances rebelled, when she questioned, criticized, resisted, her mother tightened the leash. After Frances became famous, Lillian filed to become her daughter's legal guardian, claiming Frances was unstable. The courts listened. Years later, when Frances was institutionalized, it was Lillian who signed the papers. It was Lillian who delivered her daughter to the gates of silence. But before the institutions, before the tabloids called her crazy, Frances was simply exhausted. Battling depression. Fighting a system that chewed women up and spat them out. Trying to be heard in a world that only wanted her to look beautiful and shut up. And through it all, she smiled on screen. Because that's what good girls do. Frances Farmer didn't rise through the ranks of Hollywood by charm or compromise. She forced her way in, with talent, intellect, and an unapologetic voice. But as the pressure of studios mounted, the illusion had to be built. Not just for the cameras, but for survival. The girl who once toured Soviet theaters and read poetry backstage now found herself trapped in a world of contractual obedience and fake smiles. The studio wanted a glamorous starlet. Frances gave them ice. The public wanted fantasy, Frances delivered truth. And for a while, that paradox made her magnetic. But it couldn't last. To maintain her place, she was coached, reshaped, and repackaged. Publicists dressed her in chiffon and scripted her interviews. They warned her not to mention atheism, communism, or politics. They instructed her to laugh more, think less. In photo shoots, they curled her hair, softened her angles, dimmed her intensity. She didn't rise, one insider whispered. She was sculpted. By studios. By men. By fear. By dreams too big to be real. Still, Frances tried to adapt. She acted in more films, took on roles she despised, smiled through premieres she detested. But her mind, sharp as ever, couldn't pretend for long. She began missing call times, walking off sets, clashing with directors. In one infamous moment, she told a powerful producer, "You can have me in your movie. But you'll never own me." That was the beginning of her undoing. The backlash was swift and merciless. Tabloids painted her as difficult. Executives blacklisted her. Offers dried up. But Frances, instead of begging for redemption, did something unheard of: she walked away. In the early 1940s, she abandoned film and returned to the stage, her first love. She joined small theater groups, performed for pennies, and found momentary solace in Shakespeare. For a brief, flickering moment, she was free again. But freedom, in a woman like Frances, was dangerous. When she rejected the system retaliated. She was arrested multiple times, for drunkenness, for disorderly conduct, for erratic behavior. She was dragged into courtrooms in smeared makeup and handcuffs. Paparazzi feasted. Audiences recoiled. The image of the glamorous star disintegrated. And just like that, the legend of Frances Farmer's madness was born. Was she mentally ill? Or was she simply no longer willing to lie? In 1943, after a very public breakdown and a courtroom spectacle, Frances was declared mentally unfit and institutionalized. But even there, behind walls and locked doors, she refused to disappear. Nurses complained she was too defiant, too clever. She resisted treatments, questioned doctors, and demanded to see the papers she'd never been allowed to sign. In a world that prized submission, her rebellion became a diagnosis. They called her delusional. They called her violent. They called her sick. But maybe she was just awake in a nightmare. Frances didn't reinvent herself to succeed. She reinvented herself because the world gave her no other choice. For a fleeting moment, Frances Farmer stood exactly where Hollywood wanted her, at the top. She had graced the silver screen with an intensity that critics hailed as genius without vanity. Films like Come and Get It and Rhythm on the Range proved her range. Her face became a fixture in magazines. Studio heads begrudgingly admitted that she could act circles around most of her peers. But power in Frances's hands was never docile. She didn't flirt with journalists. She didn't laugh at producer jokes. She didn't hide her disdain for a system built to control women. And so, at her peak, Frances Farmer became a problem. When she refused to attend a war bond rally in 1942, a PR stunt she deemed hypocritical, the studio punished her. Roles were revoked. Contracts were questioned. The press turned on her overnight. Suddenly, she wasn't a genius, she was a spoiled diva, unstable, dangerously independent. That same year, she was arrested in Santa Monica, allegedly for driving under the influence and assaulting police officers. The details were messy. The headlines were vicious. And Hollywood watched as one of its brightest flames began to flicker. But the true collapse came not from scandal, but from isolation. Abandoned by the industry, harassed by tabloids, and estranged from nearly everyone she trusted, Frances spiraled inward. Depression swallowed her. Rage boiled beneath her skin. She drank, she lashed out, she pleaded, but no one was listening. In 1943, she was officially declared legally insane. The court handed her over to her estranged mother, Lillian, who had long sought control of her daughter's estate and life. With her mother's signature, Frances was institutionalized at the Western State Hospital in Washington State, a facility infamous for its primitive methods and overcrowded wards. The peak was over. Now came the price. For nearly 7 years, Frances Farmer lived not as a woman, but as a patient. Records describe forced medications, solitary confinement, and aggressive behavior management. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, was administered, sometimes without consent. The walls of the hospital held screams no one outside wanted to hear. Years later, whispers began to surface. Rumors that Frances had been subjected to a lobotomy, a brutal procedure meant to dull the mind and erase disobedience. She never confirmed it. But the woman who walked out years later was quieter. Still beautiful. Still haunted. But quiet. The red carpets were gone. The scripts were gone. The voice that once defied the world was now a whisper. And yet, in interviews decades later, there was still fire. "I wasn't crazy," she once said. "I was just angry." And they called it madness. Hollywood had broken many women. But none quite like Frances Farmer. She had soared without permission. And for that, they made her fall, publicly, brutally, endlessly. By the time Frances Farmer left the asylum in 1950, Hollywood had already written her obituary. She was labeled crazy, washed up, damaged goods. The town that once courted her brilliance now refused to return her calls. She made brief attempts at comebacks, stage roles, a short-lived talk show in Indianapolis, a few interviews. But the spark that once ignited screens had dimmed. Not from madness, but from betrayal. Frances had seen too much, endured too much, and trusted too little to play the game again. She never married again. She never returned to the heights she once touched. And yet, she never apologized. When she died in 1970 at the age of 56, the world barely noticed. No parades. No retrospectives. Just a quiet passing in obscurity. But her silence echoed. Years later, writers, artists, and feminists would rediscover her story. They would see not a fallen star, but a warning. A symbol. A question carved into the marble halls of Hollywood. What happens when a woman refuses to be controlled? Frances Farmer didn't vanish. She became a ghost in the machine, a reminder of what fame can do to those who dare to be real. Her legacy isn't in awards or box office records. It's in the silence that followed her scream. And in the uneasy truth that still makes the industry shiver.